Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of History 131. This is Mr. Harris. Uh, Today, we're going to discuss the background of the French and Indian War, which was the conflict between the British colonies in North America and the French colonies in North America and their Native American allies, the Native American allies of the British and the Native American allies of the French, who played a key role in the conflict. But today I'm not going to discuss the conflict itself, but the events leading to the conflict and the conditions that led to it. So my main source is David Emery Shai's textbook America, the Essential Learning edition. And the core objective is to compare how the British and French empires administered their colonies before 1763. So 18th century North America was one of the key battlegrounds between numerous wars between Protestant Great Britain and its allies in Europe and Catholic France and its Catholic allies in Europe. Great Britain was Protestant and France was Catholic. And in the 18th century, those became the dominant European powers, and they also dominated North America. The Spanish and the Dutch colonies were in decline by the 18th century. The Spanish never devoted the necessary amount of people and resources to the colonies, and they focused more on extracting wealth like gold and silver, converting the natives to Catholicism, and their colonies remained small. There were only about 50,000 Spanish settlers in North America by 1750. So the Dutch were defeated in the Anglo-Dutch Wars between 1652 and 1674, and the English had captured what was New Netherland and New Amsterdam, which today is New York, and that actually took the Dutch effectively out of North America. So by the 18th century, the two dominant powers in North America had become France, who were sort of in the heartland along the major rivers, along the French were along the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, Montreal, in the Great Lakes, and along the Mississippi River. And the English, as we discussed in previous weeks, were along the Atlantic seaboard from Maine in the north down to Georgia in the south. And below them were the Spanish in Florida and what today is Florida, and the Spanish to the southwest of the French and what was the Louisiana Territory, where the Spanish and what today is Texas. South of that, south of Texas, was New Spain. So the British ultimately won what was known as the French and Indian War. French and Indian War again started in America. It was a conflict over control of the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys. Uh, it started actually when George Washington ambushed a French platoon near near what today is Pittsburgh. There was a French fort out there uh, called Fort Duquesne, and uh, Washington, who was a lieutenant colonel at the time, um, had 300 men with him. They ambushed a French platoon out there and then hunkered down in a fort that they built called Fort Necessity, and then were attacked by French forces and their Native American allies and compelled to surrender. But that was how that war started. After Washington went back, surrendered to the French, and went back to Virginia. Uh, England itself got involved in the war and sent British regulars in 1755, and then the war continued to escalate until the war was officially declared in Europe. The war in Europe became known as the 7 Years' War, but we're not gonna get into that today. We're gonna go over the background of the French and Indian War. Um, Britain ultimately won that war in 1763 and became the most powerful empire in the world, and gained control of the North American continent. Uh, but after that, the cost of maintaining the empire, of defending the colonies, sort of compelled the British Parliament to uh, take firmer control of the colonies, implement measures to take firmer control of the colonies, which led to a backlash by the American colonists and rising tensions between the colonists and Great Britain, which ultimately led to the outbreak of war in 1775, the American Revolution between the colonists and Great Britain. But today we're going to talk about the French colonies in America and the British colonies in America, North America, and how they came into conflict with one another. So the French colonized the North American heartland around the same time period that the English were first colonizing in Virginia and later Plymouth and Massachusetts. So Samuel de Champlain, known as the father of New France, began the settlement of New France first at Port Royal, which is north of Maine, northeast of Maine, and what was Acadia in 1605, then Quebec in 1608, which is on the St. Lawrence River, closer to the Great Lakes, closer to Lake Erie. Uh, so Champlain allowed trading companies to engage in the fur trade with the Native Americans, particularly the Huron and the Algonquian. Uh, Champlain came into contact with the Iroquois, who were the historic enemies of the Huron and the Algonquin. And Champlain himself actually fought in a war against the Iroquois with the Huron and Algonquin. He used a firearm actually, and was known as an arquebus. And after shooting a couple of people in the Iroquois tribe, they retreated in panic. And from there on out, he had forged a bond with the Huron and the Algonquin tribes, and he knew that the French would not be numerous as the English colonists. Uh, One of the reasons for that was that the French monarchy in 1627 uh, disallowed any non-Catholics from settling in New France, which meant that the number of French settlers was going to be fairly limited. So, with that in mind, Champlain, the father of New France, knew that the French colonists who were primarily fur traders, also fishermen and missionaries, they were going to have to live with and among the Native Americans. These French colonists would intermarry with the Native Americans. They would engage in cultural exchange. They had shared cultures. They exchanged folkways with each other. And one historian named Richard White called this area around the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley the Posden Hunt, or the middle ground, where there was a cultural exchange between Native Americans and the French settlers. So from Quebec, uh, the Jesuits came. The Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, had been founded in 1534 by Ignatius Loyola, the Spanish nobleman, and the the idea of the Society of Jesus was that they were the shock troops of the Catholic Church. went out and converted people who they considered pagans, non-Catholics all around the world, and they basically fought the spread of Protestantism. So the Jesuits came to Quebec, and they fanned out into the heartland of America along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers, and they lived among the natives and engaged in cultural exchange with the natives and developed close bonds with the natives. Uh, so uh, New France was huge. It's that I guess you could say the violet area on the map there. Uh, but unfortunately for the French colonists, France, like Spain, never devoted the sufficient number of colonists and money in North America for the colonists to be self-sustaining and permanent. New France sort of was was like a huge fur trading outpost of France and America, whereas the English colonies, although they were more compact, you can see them along the Atlantic coast there from Maine down to Georgia, were more highly populated. There were about by 1750 about 1.5 million English colonists versus about 70,000 French colonists, and only you see New Spain there to the south. What's Mexico? The what today is the American Southwest and Florida. There were only about 50,000 new Spaniards in North America. So unlike Spain, though, the French had a vibrant fur trade with the Native Americans, and the Jesuits had a strong influence. They forged that cultural bond with the Native Americans, and because the French had a small presence, and because they had made friendships and alliances with the Native Americans, by the time of the French and Indian War in 1754, that was an important advantage for the French, and their other main advantage was control of those big waterways that went into the heart of America, like the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River. Uh, but unlike the English, the French colonies had no elected legislatures. They didn't have political rights, and the aristocrats, known as seigneurs, ran the show in America. The seigneurs were actually granted lands called seigneuries by the King of England, land grants, and essentially peasants lived on their land, and they worked the land in exchange for a place to live. So it was really sort of a new kind of feudalism in America. Uh, King Louis the 14th made France a royal colony in 1663, and he appointed a governor general who was an absolute monarch, autocratic. In contrast to the English colonies, they were somewhat self-governing. They had elected legislatures, and they were autonomous both politically and economically. So the New France, on the other hand, was autocratic, and the monarchical rule was absolute through the king appointed governor general. So France controlled these waterways, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and what I call the Ohio Mississippi River Valley complex. Uh, Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette, they were two explorers, French explorers. They went down the Wisconsin from the Great Lakes. They went down the Wisconsin River, down the Mississippi River, and this was during the 1670s. And they wanted to see where the Mississippi River went. Some people thought it went to the Pacific Ocean. Others said it went to the Gulf of Mexico. They didn't know, so they went south down the Mississippi within 400 miles of the Gulf of Mexico and turned around because they heard that there were Spanish soldiers, Spanish forts in the area. But they from that trip they were able to determine that the Mississippi did indeed empty into the Gulf of Mexico. They were followed by Rene Robert Cavelier, and he went from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and he claimed the entire Mississippi River Valley, uh, which was known as the Louisiana Territory. It's the green on the map, and it goes from the Appalachians in the east all the way to the Rocky Mountains in the west, uh, north all the way into Canada, north of the St. Lawrence River, and south down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the French, the few French colonists that were there, those 70,000 French colonists by 1750, uh, had a had a hold on the heartland of America. But there were very few people in this region. The region was sparsely populated, and it was controlled more by Native Americans than it was by the French. But the French who were there were mostly hunters, trappers, fur traders, and missionaries, particularly the Jesuits. And throughout the colonial period, there were a total of 3,500 Jesuits in North America, mostly French, but some Spanish as well. France also established colonies in Biloxi, what today is Biloxi, Mississippi, in 1699, Mobile Bay in 1710, and in 1718, Jean Baptiste Le Moyne established New Orleans, which became the capital of the Louisiana Territory. The Spanish were alarmed by this, and as a in response, as a bulwark against further French expansion, the Spanish established um, a settlement at what became San Antonio. They built a fort there called a Presidio, and that later became the Alamo. But New France was huge, but the settlers there didn't have a strong hold on the area. But what the important advantages that they had were strong alliances with the Native Americans and control of the waterways. English, on the other hand, as we already discussed, had more compact colonies. They didn't mix with the Native Americans as much. They brought their families over. The early colonists, they intended to stay, and their colonies were somewhat politically autonomous. Some of the colonies elected their governors, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Um, the proprietary colonies, the governors were actually the proprietors, but these governors, whether elected or proprietors, had certain powers. They could appoint and approve, or they could appoint and remove officials. They commanded the militia, and they could pardon criminals. But as a balance and a check against the governors, the colonists elected legislatures or assemblies or councils. Um, and the legislatures or assemblies had important powers. They had what was called the power of the purse, where they did the taxing, they controlled government budgets, and they even, in many cases, controlled the governor's salaries, so they had influence over the governors. And they also could pass laws and legislation. So the legislatures or assemblies, according to Shai, were the most important political trend in 18th century North America. Uh, Self-government in America, according to Shai, went from being a habit to a cherished right. So in 1651, Oliver Cromwell took over England, Scotland, and Ireland in what was called the English Commonwealth, and he was almost immediately at war with Holland in what was known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and it was essentially for supremacy in the shipping lanes in the North Sea and the Atlantic. Uh, Cromwell wanted to hurt the Dutch, who England was at war with. One of the ways he could do this was not just through naval warfare, but political and economic policies, mercantilism, and this was an economic policy in which the government controlled key industries. Um, Industries were regulated, taxed, and subsidized. Subsidized means that the government supported certain industries with funds, essentially government handouts to certain industries. So under mercantilism, people with technical skills or technical acumen in key industries like the textile industry were forced to stay in the country. And meanwhile, the colonies were compelled to enrich England, the mother country. And here's how that worked. The colonies were the North American colonies were there to provide raw materials like lumber, uh, rice, indigo, tobacco, pitch, tar, wheat, and also precious metals. And the colonists were also captive consumers. That means they were forced to buy English manufactured goods. So they provided the materials for England to make the goods, and then they were expected to buy the manufactured goods that came back to North America. So the colonies were also expected to be a haven or an outlet for the poor, the unemployed, and the criminals or the religious dissenters in England. So these were unstable elements of the population. It was thought that if these elements of the population remained in England, they could engage in some dangerous activities like uprisings or subversion, espionage. So the mercantilist policy was to send these people over to America so that they could be gainfully employed in the American colony, and they would no longer be a threat in England. So, and the last major aspect of mercantilism was the colonists were expected not to produce manufactured goods that would compete with English manufacturing. So one dimension of key dimension of mercantilism was the Navigation Acts. And these were initiated by Oliver Cromwell, although he his government didn't pass all the acts. But the first Navigation Act of 1651 required that goods that were going to and coming from the colonies had to be transported in English ships only. And that was to hurt the Dutch because the Dutch would also transport colonial goods uh, for a much lower cost than the English merchants. So that was to basically cut the Dutch out of the Atlantic trade. Then there was the Navigation Act of 1660. This was after Oliver Cromwell, when Charles II was king, and this stipulated that certain cash crops, such as tobacco and rice, could only be shipped to England, not Europe. Then there was the Navigation Act of 1663. This was also under Charles II, known as the Staples Act. So that that act required that all shipments from Europe to the colonies had to first go to a port in England. Ships had to be offloaded, all the goods had to be inventoried and taxed, and then shipped to the colonies. So when the Anglo-Dutch Wars were over by 1674, England was the dominant sea power in the world. They had finally surpassed Holland, and you remember that New Netherland had been taken over by Charles II's brother, James II, in 1664. But these navigation acts put a stranglehold economically on American merchants. Shipping was not as profitable as a result of the navigation acts, and it was the New England merchants who handled 90% of North America's trade with England and Europe, the triangular trade that we had spoken of. So they were particularly hard hit, the New England merchants. So in 1678, the Massachusetts legislature, which was dominated by New England merchants, declared that the navigation acts were illegal, and King James II responded by revoking Massachusetts's charter, and he his successor, James II, in 1685, actually reorganized the New England colonies, all of them, into one large colony called the Dominion of New England. And James appointed a royal governor, Sir Edmund Andros, to be in charge of the Dominion of New England. And Andros essentially stripped New Englanders of their civil rights. He imposed new taxes. He ignored the elected legislatures in New England, and he enforced the Navigation Act, and he punished smugglers. Their ships were commonly searched, and they were tried in admiralty courts, which were run by royal officials instead of colonial courts, who would often let smugglers go. They essentially, the colonial courts essentially would not punish or prosecute smugglers. So in 1688, King James added New York, East Jersey, and West Jersey to the Dominion of New England. So you can see it in orange in the map there. There's just one mega colony with Sir Edmund Andros, who was essentially an autocratic ruler, stripped everyone of their cherished rights, and this was extremely unpopular in the colonies. But then in 1688 in England, you had the Glorious Revolution. So James II was deposed. He was kicked out of England in a coup by Prince William III of Holland, and Prince William was married to James II's daughter Mary, who was a Protestant. So this coup happened in coordination and conjunction with British elites in Parliament, and when after James II fled the country, William III and Mary met with the English Parliament, and they agreed to the Bill of Rights, or the Declaration of Rights. This solidified Parliament's power as a counterbalance to the monarchy. So Parliament could no longer be dissolved by the king. Parliament had free speech. They could meet as regularly as they wanted to. They had free elections, and also as part of the Declaration of Rights, or the Bill of Rights, Catholics were banned from being the monarchs in England. So this solidified the power of Parliament as a check on the king. And when the colonists saw what was going on in England, when they got the news, they took their cue, and in Massachusetts, the colonists revolted. The citizen militia, who were many of them merchants, lawyers, clerics in the Puritan Church, they all got together, levied the militia, and they went after Sir Edmund Andros, arrested him and his aides. Uh, revolutionaries were justified by John Locke. Now, John Locke, the philosopher that we talked about, was a Enlightenment philosopher, and he preached natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And in his two treatises on government, which was published in 1690, he said that the people, including the colonists, had the right to remove and replace tyrannical governments, which Edmund Andros clearly was. There's a picture of Edmund Andros and the angry Massachusetts citizens looking at him. He's in his fancy royal uniform there. So Massachusetts citizens uh, had Andros arrested, and then they removed themselves from the dominion of New England, and so did the other colonies that had been incorporated, including New York, Maryland, the Jerseys. They restored their own governments, but unfortunately for them, uh, William III wanted to send them a message that he did not tolerate rebellion. So William III appointed royal governors over Massachusetts, New York, and Maryland, and this was significant, particularly in Massachusetts, because um, William's move removed the religious qualification for citizenship rights in Massachusetts. So that meant that non-Puritans in Massachusetts could now vote and hold office. And this was disappointing to the colonists. New York and Massachusetts were grateful that William had removed what they described as the quote tyranny, popery, and slavery of King James II, end quote. But they were disappointed to have king-appointed royal governors. And William, even more to their chagrin, you could say, passed the Act to Prevent Frauds and Abuses in 1696. Looks like I had written 1996, but that's obviously 1696. And that essentially granted royal customs officials, king appointed officials who worked in admiralty courts, to have what were called writs of assistance or search warrants. They could seize American merchant ships, search them for smuggled goods, and prosecute smugglers in admiralty courts. This was very unpopular. After William III passed away, he was succeeded by Kings George I and George II, and Prime Minister Robert Walpole served under Kings George I and II from 1721 to 1742, and he essentially intentionally did not enforce the Navigation Acts because they were impractical, unwieldy, too expensive to enforce, and he essentially gave the colonists free rein over their trade. And this policy was known as salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was the intentional non-enforcement of the Navigation Acts. And essentially, salutary neglect emboldened the colonists, um, made them think that they were not required to obey royal laws, statutes, and regulations. And this was one of the conditions or the circumstances leading up to the revolution that added to the autonomy of the colonies. So colonial self-government was one of the key developments um, leading up to the French and Indian War in 1754 and later the American Revolution. So the colonists were used to governing themselves. They elected their own assemblies. Their assemblies could make appointments. They were increasingly self-governed, and this became a habit and what they believed was a sacred right. So in Virginia, the assembly was the House of Burgesses. In Maryland, it was the delegates. Massachusetts, it was the representatives, and these assemblies consisted of male property owners, free white male property owners. Uh, they were dominated, the assemblies, usually by the wealthy, but in some cases, like in New Jersey, there were a lot of middle class men known as mechanics in the assembly as well. But this gave the colonies sort of their own identity. They began to take charge of their own affairs politically, and they also implemented policies that benefited them economically. So they were largely autonomous, self-governing, with the exception of the king-appointed royal governors, and essentially shared power with the king-appointed royal governors, and uh, in many respects developed their own economic policies. So this was different again than the French colonies, which were autocratic and under the absolute rule of the governor general, who was appointed by the king. But the French did have a thriving fur trade with the Native Americans, and they were strong allies of the Native Americans. So when war did break out, that was an important advantage for the French, even though they were far outnumbered by the English colonies. Around 20 to 1, they were outnumbered. So the British government wanted to enforce its policies more rigidly through the policy of mercantilism, which was economic regulations on shipping, particularly. But the navigation acts essentially uh, were unenforced under Kings George the First and George the Second, under Prime Minister Robert Walpole. And the Glorious Revolution essentially, this was before Kings George the First and George the Second. Glorious Revolution essentially inspired new, more revolutionary political philosophies in America that challenged the absolute authority of kings, or the divine right of kings, with natural rights, those enumerated by John Locke. Again, life, liberty, property, fair trial, self-defense, all that good stuff. So increasingly, um, the different colonies, the British and the French colonies, were expanding, and both sought to dominate North America. And increasingly, these colonists sort of clashed over the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, and that growing conflict would come to blows in 1754.